Well, the simple answer is I was asked by the local party to stand. Over the last few years, I've been getting more and more involved with the Green Party as their spokesperson for global solidarity, which is basically the foreign policy brief. And because of Ukraine and Gaza, that's been quite a busy role. And I've been quite involved in the formulation of Green Party positions on both of those issues, particularly in the last few months on Gaza. And that I don't think that's why the local Green Party asked me. I mean, they knew I lived in Islington, so I think that's why they asked me. And I sort of thought about it, and I thought this would be worth doing because Labour's got a huge majority in Islington. It's the 24th safest seat or something. But I think somebody needs to say, to hold Labour to account. Emily Thornberry has said some dreadful things about Gaza, for instance. But this election is obviously not only about Gaza. I also think it's a chance to say what I think about politics and the political system, which is basically I don't believe in the current political system and I think it should be changed. And if there was an anti-politics vote, I would probably vote for that. And I think the Greens are probably the closest party to believing that we, every party says they believe in change. I think the Greens go a bit beyond that. They believe in people's democracy, which is what I believe in, that people should be much more involved in taking decisions about their own circumstances. Emily Thornberry is a machine politician. People can judge for themselves how Labour she have changed their position over the years. She was a big supporter of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. Now, a very different set of policies under Keir Starmer. People can make their own judgments about the merits of that. Labour has abandoned some of the most important elements of its policy, including the Green New Deal. It's watered down the protection of workers' rights. It's not going to reform the House of Lords. There's a great long list of commitments that Labour has abandoned. And, I think that stands in stark contrast to the Greens. The Greens really strongly believe in equality. They believe in a wealth tax. They believe that we have to put up taxes to afford proper public services, which I think is the most honest position of the major parties. And they believe in climate action, of course. And, I think correctly, they believe that those two things belong together, that you can't really have effective climate action without a more equal society. And that's what I believe. But as I say, they also believe in reforming the system, which I don't think the Labour Party actually does. I mean, for a start, the Greens believe in proportional representation, which Labour doesn't, because proportional representation would undermine Labour's position as one of the two main parties. There would be a greater proliferation of parties, including the Greens. The Greens would be a much bigger party in Parliament if there were proportional representation. That's not why we believe in it. We believe in it because it's fairer and is more representative. What's not to like unless you're a Tory or a Labour Party member and see your position under threat. So I think there are really big distinctions between us and the Labour Party, between me and Emily Thornberry. I don't particularly like personalising it. I don't know her. I'm sure she's a very decent person, very nice person. And you can make your own judgments about me, but if you're voting for me, you're voting for a party position. I guess you're also voting for me because I believe in a certain set of ideas about the world and about politics. So perhaps that's another differentiator. I know about our position. I can tell you all about that. And I've already kind of spelled it out. The Lib Dems don't do it enough. They're not green enough. They're not representative enough. They're not radical enough. When you're voting for a party, you're basically voting for a set of values that will be applied to certain decisions. We're not stupid. We don't think that the Greens are going to be the next government of Britain, it's likely to be Labour, but we do think the Greens, if they can have a few MPs in Parliament, will do a much better job of holding a Labour government to account and to explaining that there is a better alternative to these very watered down, middle of the road policies that they're now proposing. So I think that's the value. But also, as I say, I come back to this. For me, this is also a chance to put more fundamental ideas out there about the nature of politics and about the nature of political change. I've worked on political change all over the world, from Kosovo to Myanmar to the small island states of the South Pacific to the Western Sahara to Palestine. And, I've come to believe that the only true politics is a politics where people are genuinely involved in decisions about them. And one of the reasons we feel so cynical about politics today and about general elections, and I share that cynicism, is because we're not involved in decisions about us. We are cut out of decisions about our own circumstances. And that is a basic denial of our agency over our own lives, our own personal sovereignty. And, that has multiple negative ramifications, including huge disillusionment with our political system. If you had an anti-politics party, they would probably get the largest vote of any party. And it doesn't surprise me. The political system does not give you representation. The government has huge power over your life in 1,000 different ways. You have one chance every 5 years to put a cross in a box. Well, there's various attempts to do this. There's an attempt in Hull to set up participatory democracy. In Frome, in Somerset, a bunch of independents have got elected as local councillors, and they have introduced participatory forums to make decisions about local stuff in Frome. So there are various attempts, but the biggest examples at scale are overseas. So, for instance, in Brazil, there's been multiple projects of building participatory self-government in cities across Brazil, particularly in a place called Porto Alegre, which has actually recently suffered terrible floods. But there they've had what's called participatory budgeting, where people en masse have made decisions about the budget priorities of the government, healthcare, roads, water and sanitation, etc., with dramatic effects in terms of equality of outcomes, of the distribution of schools, of hospitals, etc., across the city. So when you include people, the results are fairer, kind of, QED. I mean, genius idea. It's kind of obvious, but we're not doing it. The other place is, of course, Rojava in northeast Syria, where these ideas have been introduced from the bottom up, into the kind of vacuum of the collapse of the Assad regime in northeast Syria. A bottom-up democracy based on the ideas of Murray Bookchin and Abdullah Öcalan has been introduced, communal self-government. I visited it. It's remarkable. Obviously, in Britain, it's not exactly analogous to northeast Syria. Nobody's pretending that our circumstances are different. But I am convinced that when people realize the potential of this, people will start to organize these assemblies, whether it's about their local school or hospital. People will gather at the places where their concerns are most at stake. And we may see the beginning of a movement of self-government that could eventually replace the top-down system that we've got today, the elective dictatorship, as Lord Hailsham called it, where literally one man takes all the decisions that matter. I mean, call that democracy, do me a favor. Well, I talk about it a lot. I mean, I'm a big talker, as you know, Ed, because I genuinely feel people spontaneously need to do this for themselves. It should not be a top-down effort. But I would also organise local assemblies. The Greens have 3 councillors in Islington, great people who are very, very familiar with local affairs. With them, I would want to organise local participatory forums to talk about the issues that matter to the people of Islington. I don't know what those are. I can guess: housing, healthcare, public services, etc. but that's just me guessing. I would much rather sit and listen to what local citizens have to say. What are the things that most bother them? It may be something else entirely. And that is the beginning of grassroots democracy, of making decisions from the bottom up. I'm not naive enough to think we can overthrow the Westminster system by having a participatory forum in Islington Town Hall, but this is something that can start and can spread. And people exerting agency over their own circumstances has an extraordinary, compelling effect on other people. It is, I really strongly believe we have a crisis of agency in Western democracies, of people feeling they are not represented, that politicians don't talk for them, that politics has become this awful kind of act for all concerned. The politicians are forced to behave in this awful, phony way, and the voters are forced to go along with it, and we all end up hating ourselves. There is an alternative, and it would need to be proved. This hypothesis needs to be tested, but it has been done in other parts of the world, and it can be done. The only point of an MP is to represent what their local constituents want. And I would want to know what those things were. And the best way to do that is to gather people and listen to them. It's not to, there's a value to campaigning and canvassing and knocking on doors and listening, meeting people, but it's not enough. You need a proper space, a political space where people can put their views and be heard and their needs acknowledged in a very real and human way. That is not available now. That does not exist. All politics is a kind of horrible facsimile of that experience. And that's what I'd like to try and do. And what I did in Parliament would be informed by that, of course. But I think probably my most important task would be to try to introduce that. It's a practice. It's not just rhetoric and putting your hand up in the House of Commons and, signing a motion to do this or that. I'm not saying those things are not important, but the thing that I would most like to do is establish a new practice, is encourage it. Again, I can't do it. If there isn't a will out there, it can't be done. But I know how to do it. I know people who know how to do it, and give it a shot and see what happens. And hopefully, it will catch fire. Well, I've worked on Israel-Palestine many times in the past. I was the Israel-Palestine head of section in the Foreign Office years ago during the happier days of the so-called peace process, the Oslo agreements, and I was head of Middle East policy at the UK mission to the UN, where we did a lot of resolutions on Israel-Palestine. So, I've been part of this for a long time. What brings it to resolution is an end to the occupation. We have to be really clear about that. I really reject this kind of framing of it as two equal parties battling over the same piece of land, historic grudges against each other, injustice on both sides, or blah, blah, blah. There is an occupation of one party by another, and until that ends, there will not be peace. And that used to be a clear plank of British policy towards Israel-Palestine. When I was desk officer, we used to talk about the Security Council resolutions that demand an end to the occupation. And that was the kind of bedrock of our policy. You won't hear government ministers talk about it now. You won't hear Labour politicians talk about it. But it is the fundamental requirement of peace. The occupation has to end. Then it is for Israelis and Palestinians together to work out some kind of political arrangement that might work. And the basis for that has got to be equal rights for Arabs and Jews. And that might mean a two-state solution. It might mean a one-state solution where people live together with equal rights guaranteed for all. Maybe some kind of confederal solution might be the answer. I don't want to dictate what that should be. I find the attachment to the two-state solution a little bit fetishistic and unrealistic. There is no support for it in Israel. There is very little support for it in Palestine. So I don't quite see how it's supposed to come about. External parties are not willing to put sufficient pressure on the parties to impose a two-state solution. The Europeans and Americans are clearly not willing to put sufficient pressure on Israel to agree a two-state solution, and the Israeli government has made abundantly clear it doesn't want a two-state solution. So we have to return to the fundamental demand to end occupation, and that will mean pressure on Israel, no question. In its current dispensation, we have an extremist right-wing government in Israel. It will not leave the occupied territories without external pressure. And we have to muster that external pressure through sanctions, direct sanctions on the leadership of Israel. The Palestinians have to be given space to find their own political leadership that is legitimate and genuinely representative of all the Palestinian people. And these are the beginnings of what might be a longer term solution. I think the Labour Party has been a disgrace on Gaza. It has abandoned fundamental rules of international law and the laws of war in particular. Keir Starmer and indeed Emily Thornberry have at moments approved of Israel's action in cutting off food and medical supplies to food and fuel and water to the Gaza Strip, which is condoning collective punishment, which is a war crime. So how bad does it have to get? You condone a war crime? That's what Labour has done. It was very, very slow to call for a ceasefire. The Green Party started calling for a ceasefire pretty soon after October the 7th, because we believe, and I think, everybody ultimately accepts this, there is no military solution to this problem. There is only a political solution, and pursuing a military solution will just make things worse and will cost a lot of lives. And that's precisely what we've seen. 35,000 people are dead, mostly women and children, and support for Hamas is, if anything, greater than it was. So, what has been achieved in terms of Israel's security, let alone any other measure, the bloodshed has been horrendous. The human suffering has been horrendous. And for a long time, the Labour Party, like our government, was content to see that continue. And only now, recently, after months and months of slaughter, has the Labour Party started to talk about an end to the fighting. But, I think people need to reflect on what that says about Labour's principles in foreign policy as a whole. David Lammy talks about a rules-based international order, just like the Tories, by the way, very difficult to distinguish between them. What they have done in Gaza is not supporting a rules-based international order. It is the opposite. It is undermining that rules-based order because it is exempting Israel from these rules. The laws of war, international humanitarian law, Security Council resolutions, they've given Israel a free pass. And that is double standards. We rightly condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, and we demand that the world condemns Russia, as they should. But that call is undermined by the application of double standards in Gaza. The world isn't stupid. Other countries, I talk to them at the UN, to diplomats of other countries, they see this. The way that Britain and the US have defended Israel at the UN Security Council, have voted to stop resolutions calling for a ceasefire. I mean, they are shocked and appalled. And if I was a British diplomat today, which I'm glad to say I'm not, I would be ashamed. Well, it happened in 2004 when I submitted secret evidence to the first official inquiry into the war. I was then a senior British diplomat. I'd worked in Iraq at the UK mission to the UN for many years, so I knew all about it, WMD and all of that. It was a seismic event in my life, as it was for so many people, above all for Iraqis, and I don't want to compare my experience to them, but it was a huge rupture. It ended my career as a diplomat that I thought would be my career for the rest of my life, and set me on a different course, which I'm ultimately happy it did. But it profoundly disillusioned me about the nature of government. This was a democratic government that launched a blatantly illegal and unnecessary war that cost 500,000 lives, and the people responsible have not been held accountable. That is pretty shocking. And it remains something I feel very, very strongly about and talk about when I can, because that lack of accountability is a systematic failure of our political system. It's not just Iraq, it's also Grenfell, it's post office scandal, the infected blood scandal. We see it over and over again. The institutions look down on everybody else. They're not accountable, they're not transparent. And that has changed my view of politics fundamentally. That will always be the case as long as a few people have power over the many. And we need to invert that pyramid. Inequality myself. Wages for most people have flatlined for 15, 20 years since the global financial crisis. That's not talked about. Labour Party doesn't talk about it. Certainly the Tories don't talk about it. Most people in this country, large majority of in this country, are in real terms poorer than they were 15, 20 years ago. And that number also conceals a very large number of people, several million people, who are living in great poverty. And I think, like Gandhi said, you judge a society by how it treats the worst off, the most vulnerable. And those are the most vulnerable. And we need to attend to that. And if they are better off, we are all better off. That, I think, is primary concern. Personally, I think the climate crisis is a very, very major emergency that we need to address very urgently with much, much greater action, both nationally and internationally. But as I've said before, Ed, I mean, if I'm elected, my first priority will be to attend to the wishes of my constituency, of my constituents. I'm nothing. I'm not even there. I don't even see myself as their voice or something pretentious like that. I will be your voice. I don't really believe in that. I believe in them having their say and taking control over their own circumstances as much as possible. So, my job will be to facilitate that as far as possible. The Greens are not very well known. They don't get a lot of mainstream media coverage, which is wrong. We are squeezed out by the dialogue about the two main parties. Mainstream media plays that game and squeezes us out. So learn about the Greens and realize that they are electable. Greens get elected. We have lots and lots of councillors now. We have nearly 1,000 councillors nationally. And electing Greens is a positive thing to do, even in a Labour constituency, traditionally Labour constituency. We can send a message. So, I hope that my background, my resignation over Iraq, etc., my history speaks of a certain quality of who I am, but that's for others to judge. Learn about Green Party policy and realise that we are a plausible electoral force and that we can do things if we're elected. That's what I would say. Of course, if you want to help, get in touch. If you want to knock on doors, canvass, leaflet, all that, be delighted to have your assistance. I realise that a lot of people have been very loyal to Labour for a long time. That's a hard thing to give up. But I do think Labour has given up on some of its fundamental principles. It has abandoned core policies about making our society fairer and greener. And the Green Party has those policies. But as I say, I think the Green Party, even unlike Corbyn and certainly unlike Starmer, believes in a fundamental change to the way politics is conducted, that power should be put in the hands of the people, through organising the kinds of assemblies that I've talked about. And I don't think even Jeremy Corbyn, he kind of talked about it, but he didn't talk about it much. So I think the Greens, it does offer a kind of radical alternative, to standard mainstream politics. And I would urge people to consider that. We need to reject the way politics is conducted because it's basically inauthentic. What I would urge people is to think about something else. What would a better kind of system of self-government look like? I personally think that only comes through self-government from the bottom up. And I think that's a plausible alternative. It's been routinely dismissed. Oh, don't be ridiculous. We've had the oldest democracy in the world and all this kind of nonsense. But it's obviously not working. People are fed up with it. The society is not fair. It is not inclusive. People are treated badly. We are destroying the planet. It's a long list of failure. And we've got to consider radical ideas to improve matters. And, that's what I would urge people to think about.